We talk a lot about a responsible transition, and I often use visual analogs, and we think of it in terms of a three-legged stool. So it's all about, for us, affordability, reliability, and clean. And you've got to get all three of the legs right. We spent a lot of time talking about the clean. I don't think we've been honest with Canadians about what the reliability and the affordability components of the three-legged stool actually require. They're critical.
Welcome to Speaking of Business, conversations with Canadian innovators, entrepreneurs, and business leaders. I'm Goldy Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. I want you to take a moment to think about all of the things in our daily lives that require electricity. It makes the lights go on, heats our homes, keeps our food cold, energizes our phones, and powers our batteries. Frankly, the list is endless and it's growing. In our modern plugged-in world, our need for electricity is becoming almost insatiable. But where that electricity comes from matters. Just ask John Kousinioris, President and CEO of TransAlta Corporation. The Calgary-based company operates more than 75 power plants in Canada, the United States, and Australia, and is one of the largest renewable power producers in North America. Now, it wasn't always that way. TransAlta used to generate much of its electricity from coal plants. But after a concerted effort to transform its operations in 2021, TransAlta closed the last of its coal plants in Alberta. It resulted in a 50% reduction in its greenhouse gas emissions. How did TransAlta do it? And as the world shifts its energy mix, what can we learn from TransAlta's experience? I'm at TransAlta headquarters in Calgary to find out. Welcome to the podcast, John.
It's great being here, Goldie. Thank you so much for the introduction.
All right, so you're on the front lines of the energy transition, and a few years ago you went from being one of Canada's biggest carbon emitters to dramatically reducing your emissions. And, I've heard it from you directly. You're not done yet. But talk to me first about how did you get here? How did you do it?
It's sort of an interesting journey, and I think the best way to articulate it would be to provide a bit of a history lesson. So in 2015, we had a change in government in the province of Alberta, and they made a decision at that point in time, from a policy perspective, to phase out coal by 2030. And our company had just literally in the year before I started the company, I think in 2011, had just commissioned a new coal-fired power plant, about $1.5 billion investment, expecting it to run to 2063. So our initial reaction at the time as a company was to fight the decision, was to just oppose it and try to kind of say, look, you need the generation that we have. It is a natural advantage. Alberta's been blessed with a lot of coal. It's the right thing to do. And very quickly, I think, what ended up happening was we came to realize that it was a bit of a wake-up call, actually. And that rather than challenging or advocating for the status quo, we should actually embrace the change. And that resulted in us having a series of discussions and technical work to see if we could take the coal-fired generating units that we had and convert them to natural gas. And when you do that, you actually reduce emissions by 40, 50% per unit. If you go back to about 2015, we would emit about 40 megatons a year of CO2 in Canada, about 5% of Canada's, roughly speaking, aggregate emissions. And roll forward to today, and we're kind of in about 10 megatons a year. So that's about a 75%-ish reduction from where we were. So we've gone from 5% of the emissions to less than 1% of Canada's emission. And that reduction journey that we've had, the 30 megatons of emissions that we've reduced, is about 10% of Canada's Paris commitment in terms of, the reduced emissions that our country has signed up for. So it's been an incredible journey for all of us. Since 2021, we have gone from having 9 coal-fired plants, which we actually operated in Canada. The 9 coal plants over time have become 3 gas plants in Canada. We also had 2 coal plants in the United States that we ran. One of them was shut down at the end of 2020. The other one will be shut down at the end of 2025, and then we will have no longer any coal-fired generation. At that same time, we began increasing our focus on renewables. We had a significant thermal fleet, coal and gas and high emissions, but we were also the largest wind power company in Canada and basically the sole hydro company in the province of Alberta. So we sort of were a foot in each camp, so to speak. So over time, what we've seen is a waning of our thermal generation and an increasing emphasis on renewables as we move forward. I think, if anything, what has surprised us is the speed with which the transition has occurred, which has been remarkable. And I think we all underestimated it. Even today, when we think about our gas units, we begin to think about how long they will run. Forget the coal units, but the gas units. And even they have, a limited shelf life as we go forward. So it's been fascinating. And we're very, very proud of our emissions reductions. One of the key things we're focused on from a cultural perspective is a sense of purpose. And I think it really energizes me, and I know it energizes our employees when they think of our clean energy credentials.
I have to ask, it turns out that it's even hard to do renewable projects.
Yes. Look, it's getting harder to do renewables projects.
Why is that? I thought that's what we're all trying to do.
It is part of what we're trying to do. We talk a lot about a responsible transition, and you've heard me, Goldy, talk about this before. And I often use visual analogs, and we think of it in terms of a three-legged stool. So it's all about, for us, affordability, reliability, and clean. And you've got to get all three of the legs right, because if one breaks, the stool tips over.
And can we achieve all three?
I think it's challenging. The thing that troubles me about it is we spend a lot of time talking about the clean. I don't think we've been honest with Canadians about what the reliability and the affordability components of the three-legged stool actually require. They're critical. And, I've told policymakers, if you do the transition in a way that is overly expensive on people or creates blackouts or brownouts in terms of what we're trying to do, people won't be with you.
Yeah, I suspect you lose support.
Absolutely. Business won't be with you. We can't do that. So that's why we tend to focus on responsible. In terms of coming back to your question on renewables, it was easier before, I would say. The challenges that we see today run everything from the regulatory right through to the actual execution and maintenance of a project. So for example, on a wind farm, the time it takes to get it permitted is longer. It used to take months. It can take well over a year now. The time it takes to get into the queue to make sure that you'll have an interconnection to transmission can take multiple years. And in the United States, we operate, as you pointed out at the beginning, in Canada, the US, and Australia. 4 years may not be an unusual time period for you to actually get in the slot that you need to move forward. The costs of executing projects are significantly higher. I would say a wind farm today costs 30% higher than it did even 3 or 4 years ago. Opposition from people in typically rural areas where we tend to site these plants or facilities has increased pretty dramatically, I would say.
What do they say? What do they
Well,
oppose to?
a lot of folks, you see the renewables pause that just occurred here in the province of Alberta. That was actually quite responsive. I think the government was responding to concerns that people had about, I think, really three major concerns, and they've tried to address all three. One of them was viewscapes. I think, a lot of people driving down in parts of southern Alberta, southwestern Alberta, it's not like you see one or two turbines. You see hundreds and hundreds of turbines. So the landscape is changed. It's altered. And for some of the landowners, it's not a big deal. They get the rental payments required for being there. But for people that have lived there for multiple generations, other communities, visually it's an issue for them. And in many cases, the resource is best in areas of particular natural beauty. The foothills, areas approaching the Rockies, the wind patterns come in over the Rockies and provide you the best resource, but in a place that also has natural beauty. So it's becoming more challenging. And if you ever had a chance, I remember years ago taking off from the airport in LA and you typically take off to the west and, you're out into the Pacific, and then planes typically go north and you're following the coastline. And if you happen to be seated on the east side of the plane, so on the right side of the plane as you go out and you look out your window, it's actually staggering. There is an area, probably about 20 minutes flying time, northeast of Los Angeles to Tehachapi and the like. You see lakes of solar panels, like lakes. It's not like one or two. It's literally lakes of solar panels. And you look out into the foothills and you see the sort of Sierras are coming out there. And on every sort of ridge, there are wind turbines, and not one or two. We're talking thousands, right? So there's no free ride here. There's a visual impact that, I think is real. So everything from permitting to finding the people to actually build the projects, which are typically in remote locations, to servicing them, to making sure that we get the reliability from the supply chain and that it's reliable. From the moment that you envision a project to the time that you actually commission it, the timeframes are elongated, the costs have increased, and I think, rightly so, the sensitivity that the communities have around it. You have proponents because they like the tax revenues and the income that it leaves in the communities, but not everybody is aligned.
On the upside, we're having these conversations now.
Finally.
So maybe there is some benefit to education and getting people to realize that it's going to be hard to make all three of these legs of the stool work.
And it's going to take longer to go from where we are to where we aspire to be. It's interesting. I was at a meeting in Oslo about 2 years ago. I was part of Team Canada, and there were every few years there was a meeting of electricity industry representatives from the European Union, Canada, the United States, Australia, and Japan. And what was interesting was the head of Electricity Canada at that point put up a slide, and it simply had the number of days left until 2030, when we had, a net zero kind of targets. And it was hilarious because everybody, all of the representatives of the, the various groups, they all chuckled. The practical reality of doing what we notionally aspire to do within the kind of short and increasingly short, every day goes by, gets shorter, time frame, just the practical reality of getting there, it was stark. I mean, it was a very powerful slide. We didn't need to say anything else. We just needed to put up there's X number of days left. Yeah, are you going to get there?
Do you think Canadians themselves are more tuned into this reality now? Because, they've had so much come at them. And I think we all agree with the objectives. We're just, I think, trying to make sure that people understand what the facts are and that there is a cost to all of this.
I think there's still a gap, I would say. And look, every industry, every business has complexities. So I'm not suggesting that our industry is any more complex or difficult, but it's a public good. It's interesting. When you began our conversation, you talked about the things that electricity does. I speak in a very similar narrative to our employees. We talk about powering and empowering communities. Like when people ask me what I do, I don't say I work for a power company. I say, we provide the essentials of life, right? Businesses, schools, hospitals. That's like without power today,
airports.
You've got nothing. From heating your home to, keeping the lights on when somebody's in the middle of a life and death surgery, in the hospital, right? It enables everything that we do. And that's a very powerful thing that we try to do. So I think people understand the importance of electricity. I think people are intuitively in favor of decarbonization. I think they accept that it's a laudable thing to do, something that we should all be trying to do. I don't think we've had honest discussions, and we're as much to blame, the industry, as much as government is certainly, about what it costs to get there, the challenges associated with getting there, because I'm always reminded that it's easy to say, yep, I'm in favor of decarbonization. But what's interesting is there's often a second question that is asked, which is, well, how much are you willing to spend personally, whether it's a business or an individual, household? Yeah. And that's when the wheels all fall off the car, right? Because people aren't willing to spend what it takes.
There actually was a survey done of Canadians where Canadians said, look, this is an important issue to me, and I'm willing to put a couple $100 on the table for it.
It's not going to do it.
And a couple $100 for a year.
I know, it's not going to do it. You're not saying per month, right?
No, exactly.
And times are expensive. It's not
right.
like people have a ton of cash sitting around. So it's challenging.
I've heard you say that investors are in many ways ahead of governments when it comes to the transition. Explain to me what you mean by that.
So when we look at, if I can sort of use financial speak, the multiples that companies that are more pure play renewables are, when I look at the pools of capital that are available for renewables development globally and storage, it's high. So when I look at what companies do when they procure clean power to drive their operations, particularly those companies that have what I would call a significant interface with consumers, where there is an imperative to have proper clean credentials, right, in terms of what you're doing. So if you're Nike or if you're Microsoft or you're, Amazon or you're a company like that, or even a food service company that's actually providing kind of those goods and services to consumers, there's an expectation. I think it goes without saying that you need to provide clean energy to those kind of people. So I think they're ahead of the curve, and I think government is kind of reacting and trying to figure out what to do, whereas industry's already doing it. I mean, we look at the renewables procurement that has occurred here in the province of Alberta. It's been staggering. And it was done without any particular government policy to drive it. It was in response to a demand, largely among industry, plus pools of capital, to actually drive out the build and procure greener power that was necessary
And
to see it
supported by
through.
shareholders, obviously, or you wouldn't be doing it.
But I think what's happened is, and again, we talk about the great things of our industry. There is some dirty laundry as well. So I've actually seen the pendulum shift back a little bit. There was a lot of exuberance around it, I would say. And I think when you get down to the hard, cold reality of executing, did you build the project on time, on budget? Did you actually create value for your shareholders in terms of holding the returns that were expected on a go-forward basis? Are the returns on a risk-adjusted basis appropriate for the risks associated with the clean projects? I think the industry needs to get better. I think we've done just a passing grade, I would say, on that. And I think people are actually seeing better returns in natural gas fire generation. So we're seeing, I think, more of a balanced approach going forward, where I think people are recognizing that we've got to look at the transition sort of holistically.
In a portfolio way. And
That's right.
Speaking of gas, what role do you think natural gas is going to have to play in Canada?
I think it depends on the jurisdiction. So look, my personal view is that natural gas is going to be around and is going to play a considerable role for many, many years to come.
Decades.
I agree. And it depends on the jurisdiction. So, if you're in Quebec or you're in British Columbia or Manitoba and you're blessed with incredible hydro resources, you're very fortunate. And Ontario's got a lot of hydro too, and it's got the nukes as well. But when you're looking at a jurisdiction like Alberta, where 80+% of the generation came from natural gas, shifting it to something that is cost effective and reliable, it's hard to find something that's better than gas right now. So I think the renewables will continue to come in, but I think there will continue to be a role for natural gas to create that reliability part of the stool, the three-legged stool that we talked about, for a considerable period of time. In part because I think, Goldy, it isn't clear to me what are the technologies that are going to, on a cost-effective way, trump that generation in the 2030s.
You read my mind on the next question, which is, do we actually have the tools in the toolbox that are going to get us to these targets we're setting, or are we actually assuming, banking on, counting on innovation of new technology to help us get there? Like, we don't even know what we're talking about.
No, we don't. And it's interesting. Shortly after I stepped into the role, I developed a new technology team in our company. And look, we're not big enough that I can have, 50 people running around in white lab coats doing R&D. But we needed to be, one of the things we learned was that your technology, i.e. coal, in our case, can be made obsolete quickly. Whether it's because of a technological breakthrough or because of government policy, it can go. It can be very, very fleeting in terms of where you are. So it was important for us to spend the time scanning to see what will be the technologies, not so much in the 2020s, but in the 2030s and beyond. So the kinds of things that we're looking on, kind of pillars for our company, we're looking at hydrogen. We've made an investment in a company that is looking at processes to, develop hydrogen at site through pyrolysis, that we might have a fuel that would be cost effective that we could run. We made an investment in Energy Impact Partners, which is looking at their deep decarbonization fund. So our team is able to work with their scientists and experts with a view to looking at what's the latest and greatest in everything from carbon capture technologies to storage to fusion to fission. We're literally looking at everything and kind of saying, this is kind of the state of play. We're doing a little, we've got letters of intent with various people, and we're exploring the possibility of repowering or what new technologies may be there. I think it's critical, but I can't tell you today that it's this or that. We're trying to keep a pretty broad net.
So in that backdrop, you still have a workforce, and you employ a lot of people. An energy transition, you would think, implies that there will be a workplace transition as well. So give us a sense of the impact that even just moving away from coal had on your workforce, and what did you do about it?
I'm glad you asked that. This is something that I'm actually pretty passionate about, Goldy, and something that I don't think gets talked about enough. So we used to run the largest open pit coal mine in Canada. And the reason we had coal plants was we had an abundance of coal, so you put the plants on top of literally on top of the resource. And that's the case with us in Alberta. It's no different in Saskatchewan. It was the same in Washington State. That's what the resource was. So we used to have, at one point, I think over 2,000 men and women working in our coal mine, many for multiple generations. And we're down to 50 people doing reclamation there. We used to have one of our coal plants in Centralia, Washington, which we shut down, resulted in over 100 people losing their job. Our company has probably never performed better financially as we have today, and we're doing it with about half the workforce that we had before because of the impact, not just the people, but communities that have occurred by a pulling back of some of the types of generations that we've had. And the types of generations that we've pulled back on were employee-heavy generation. So we often get into these discussions, like if you had apples to apples, a coal plant, a gas plant, a wind farm, a solar plant, 200 employees in a coal plant, maybe 50, 60 employees in a gas plant, maybe 10 employees in an equivalent wind farm. And by the way, we're going down in reliability now. And then, with the solar farm, like maybe 3. And, we chuckle about it sometimes, and maybe some goats actually to eat the grass, right? And literally keep it in place. So there are jobs that will be created for sure in terms of the construction and the build out that occur, but it's not the same. And the compensation received isn't the same either. So it's complicated. And when, you hear people talk about
them, though? Can you help them?
We
with
do.
training?
So when you hear about people, I'm glad you asked that. So when we often hear people talk about a just transition, it doesn't feel very just, I can tell you, for those men and women, because they were just doing their jobs and they've done it for many, many years and they worked hard in a challenging environment, right? So when we were in the process of transitioning our plants from coal to natural gas, significant employee impacts up at our Sundance and Keepill. So this is just west of Edmonton, about 45-minute drive west of Edmonton. So we did everything from job fairs, career days, assessing people, like, do you have expertise in a particular area and you're missing a ticket, that should you get it to see if you can get, employment elsewhere. And it's interesting sometimes with government, you get the sense of, look, we've got programs that provide income support to these people as they transition out. And what we like to remind them is, yeah, but they don't actually want that. They want a job. The one thing I would say we've been fortunate about, and it's literally pure luck, is that our workforce in some of the facilities that probably had a shortened life tended to be a little bit older. So we were lucky that a number of the men and women were kind of approaching or near retirement age. And, with a bit of financial incentives and whatnot, it was just kind of time for a lot of them to be thinking about it. But if you were 30 and you'd been working at the facility for only a few years, that was not a great answer for you. And in some cases, some of them have to go elsewhere to find the kind of work that they need, particularly in the rural areas. And, luckily enough in Alberta, there's the oil sands and other places that people can go. But it's challenging.
Well, look, we've covered a lot of ground and I spent a lot of time because I think there is a curiosity and an interest. And you bring, frontline real experience about the challenges and the opportunities that this transition represents. So thank you for sharing that. But part of our podcast is also about talking about leadership, about your own story and so forth. So I want to pivot to that, if I may. Now, were you born in Canada or were you born in Greece?
I was born in Calgary. Yeah,
I'm
a relatively rare these days native Calgarian.
So you're born in Calgary. Yeah. Your parents came to Canada from Greece. My parents moved to Calgary from India, where I was actually born. I'm wondering the importance of the experience of our parents and the values that they imposed on us, going back, you're probably similar age, like to grow up in that time.
I think you're much older, actually.
Am I? Okay.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Could be that gray hair that you wear.
Look, I suspect our stories are somewhat similar in that. Family for my brother and I, there's two in the family.
Ditto, by the way. Just me and my little brother.
The two, yeah. And again, a little brother, so I was the oldest one. Although he's smarter than me. He's just retired at 57, so he's doing something better than I am. But there was a narrative in our family about leaving Greece, which was, a pretty hardscrabble existence. I mean, they were, both my mom and dad were from a rural part of the country. I think my grandfather had something like 8 acres of land that he was going to have to split between 4 different kids. So, it was very agrarian, not a great life. So it was all about leaving, like as much as they loved Greece, it was literally all about opportunity, leaving to get to a place with new horizons that could actually help their children. And that was a narrative, I have to tell you, in the kitchen table for as long as I can remember. It was the notion of sacrifice, like we left friends, family, the cultural elements to come to a place that we feel comfortable. And my parents are passionate. They're both still alive, which is great. My dad turns 94 this year. They're passionate Canadians. Whenever they travel, they're getting a bit old now. Whenever they travel back to Greece, they find it weird there. They're, it's like they can't wait.
Canadian.
It's nice to sort of spend time visiting family. It's like, oh my God, thank God we're on the Air Canada plane. My dad wants to see what happened to the Calgary Stampeders, right, as they're on the flight back home. But there was always a narrative around, we left so that you guys could have a better life, my brother and I. And so there was kind of almost a responsibility in a weird sense, an expectation that you needed to
don't screw it up.
Perform. Yeah, don't screw it up. And that was everything from school to work. And speaking of work, my brother and I, my parents, like many Greek families, were in the restaurant business. So I remember being 11 and working the cash register at the restaurant. And my brother was the same thing. So you began working at a very, very young age in the family business. And that was an expectation. So it was, I sometimes wonder, honestly, when I think of my kids today. I'm blessed with 3 kids. I've got a 25-year-old son and 2 young daughters, 11 and 8. I'm pretty soft, I got to say, with them. I think and it doesn't mean that my parents didn't love me, but it was just, the narrative was different. The expectations, I think, were actually higher. And I think we were exposed to work and the expectations of work at a very early age. So
do you worry about your kids having it easy, and it's going to be tough for them, right?
Yeah,
Let's be honest.
It's interesting. I think you and I have talked about this before. I remember, I used to work at one of the national law firms, and this is years ago now, somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago. They brought in a company that was going to coach some of the lawyers in the company. And the idea was, we'll coach our better performers and some of our weaker performance, and we'll lift the performance of the company as a whole. And I remember speaking to the woman that was doing the coaching, and she just looked at me and said, John, your journey isn't unusual and almost predictable, just because, your parents and Goldy, I think some of the same things would have applied with you, right? She goes, the real challenge is your kids. I said, tell me what you mean. He goes, well, you guys, you fix everything for the kids.
We prevent them from failing.
Totally.
You and I failed a ton, I'm guessing.
Always, right? And I think the value of failing is greatly underappreciated. And I think it's massive. It's an interesting point. So something my wife and I talk about from time to time. Maybe we should just expose them a little bit more and let them kind of flounder.
How is it that you're able to help them knowing this? Like, that you're making life a little easy for them, but surely they're coming to you for advice, Dad, Mom.
My daughters don't. They just roll their eyes at me, and rightly so, which is pretty much par for the course. I mean, I do have these discussions with my son from time to time. You know what's more powerful, though, I think, Goldy? I don't know what it's like with your family. It's whenever we have a family dinner, which we try to do at least once a week. We've been blessed. My parents live in the Calgary area. And my dad will tell them stories. And to the extent that he can capture their attention for a bit before they watch TV or run off and steal one of our iPhones to play with, it's pretty powerful, I think, coming from him, because he talks about his own hardships growing up. And he can't relate.
They can't
right?
relate.
World War II, went to grade 6, kind of, in a one school classroom. Not great. He goes, we learned how to kind of sound out a bunch of words, the alphabet, and multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. That was kind of it. You were, off. So I'm not sure.
Well, let's talk about your own leadership journey. You and I met long before you got this job, actually. You weren't even in this company. You were at the law firm you mentioned. And here you are, the CEO of TransAlta. That was, all planned, or how did you end up here?
None of it was planned. I received a call one day from a headhunter who said, hey, John, we'd like you to meet with the CEO of a company. They're looking for general counsel. And I actually said, no, I don't want to meet. I'm good where I am. I was a corporate department head. I had a pretty busy practice. I wasn't interested in making the transition at that point. And they said, it was almost like, do me a favor. And
what have you got to lose?
Yeah, we're just trying to get some candidates. And by the way, it's a bit of a different company. It's TransAlta. It's a power company. It's a company with a long legacy in Alberta, which kind of was interesting. It wasn't oil and gas, which typically in Calgary would have been more that way. So I said, okay. And I went and I met with the CEO. And I remember it was Don Farrell, who was my predecessor, who was a great leader for our company and managed to navigate.
I have a great podcast with her as well, as a matter of fact.
And you know what? I haven't heard it, and I will make a point of listening to it. And she was running late. And I remember sitting down with her. I was the fourth of 4 interviews she had done that afternoon. And she goes, so tell me why you want to work for TransAlta. And I kind of looked at her and I said, whoa, like, I'm not sure I do. Why should I work for TransAlta? She was quite taken aback, right?
Sure,
Like, it was like, oh my
sure.
God. So what should have been like a 45-minute conversation I remember calling her husband, and I think they were flying to Vancouver, said, look, I'm going to be a little bit late. We just talked about culture, because the law firm I was at had been on a cultural journey and always prided itself on having a high esprit de corps. So we didn't talk about my skills or work or the company. We just talked culture and what it means to an organization, how it moves forward. So that was the first time this whole journey began, I would say. And then I finally came to the realization that I didn't quite have the same spring in my step as I did at the law firm. And like, is this all there was? And, you know, sometimes you got to stand on the edge of a cliff and sort of jump. So I did. And I came over as the chief legal officer of the company, and over time became kind of an officer at large, really, per Don, and then chief growth officer, which was a bit of a misnomer because I actually ran our renewables and gas business too at that title, then chief operating officer, and then I became the CEO just a bit over 3 years ago. So none of it was remotely preordained. None of it was within the realm of my even sort of consideration until Don candidly planted a seed, you know, some number of years after I'd been in the company. And then it became a bit of an exercise in kind of rounding out my experience. But I love going in the field. So that's one thing I did at her encouragement. So spend a lot of time, you know, climbing turbines in our gas facilities, in all of our jurisdictions.
You weren't the lawyer when you were there?
No,
Guy with a suit?
and I love, we do culture tours in our company. We have been on a journey to really emphasize, you know, 3 core tenets, which are results, learning, and purpose. And we literally show up, and it's just, you know, I'll make a few remarks about things that are going on, and then it's just an open, like, our employees are there from whatever facility, and it can be as little as 5 to as many as like 100 at Alberta Thermal. And it's like, whatever question you want to ask, just go. And like, I love it. And I love connecting with our employees. I think we owe them candor. And sometimes we deliver really hard messages, including about the viability of the business units that they're in and what we're doing, the challenges we face from a regulatory perspective, from a policy perspective, all of that. Candidly, I think we have a responsibility. We owe it to them. And, you know, you mentioned leadership and whatnot. I mean, I think for me, being the chief operating officer during the COVID pandemic, like, there was no playbook for us. And I remember at that time trying to figure out, like, what's the framework through which we'll make decisions? And I had actually, about 1.5 years before, sort of refreshed or revamped our 5 values. Respect, you know, integrity, safety, and we talked about sustainability and innovation. And it was those values of particularly the safety, respect, and integrity that drove our interactions with our employees. And that kind of was a bit of my journey, to be honest, was kind of dealing with our employees. I started emailing every day. I would email, you know, sort of a dozen of our employees, like, are you doing okay?
Should employers do more to educate employees about some of the challenges that your businesses are facing and how it impacts them?
Yes. I actually think there's no downside.
Why doesn't it happen?
I think people do it. I think you literally have to do it. I think sometimes, and look, I can only speak for my own experience. I think there's times when you get so consumed by the project or what you're doing that, like, 5 months go by and you haven't engaged people as much. Yeah, sure, you can do a town hall or whatever, but it's not the same as sitting down with a group of people and just kind of saying, like, here's the hard, cold kind of reality. And I think some of them don't want to hear it, candidly, Goldy. But I think it's the right thing to do. And there's never been a single time when I've done it, either individually or with our team, that I've regretted doing it. If anything, it's always led to discussions that I wasn't anticipating and were super, super insightful on the part of our employees. So it's really a two-way discussion. I mean, I understood where they're coming from better. And sometimes it requires challenging them. You know, they'll make a statement about something that isn't in fact true. And I think leaving that unanswered or unaddressed is inappropriate too. I think we should all strive to do it.
Okay, we're winding up. I'm going to have some fun at the end here with some rapid fire questions. But before I do, we talked earlier about Canada and the choice of being here. Looking out for your kids, are you hopeful and optimistic about our country?
I'm an optimist fundamentally, I would say, Goldy. So when I look at my kids, I'm actually kind of amazed every day. Like, I look at their energy. I think about our educational system, which for all of its challenges, is still great and accessible by and large. I look at the resource endowment that this country has, which is everything from our people and the various cultures of people that we have, right through to the oil and gas we have, to the agricultural products that we produce,
Minerals,
to
forestry,
the minerals,
oceans.
forestry, oceans, fishing, everything that we have, to just the minds of our people and their creativity. And when you think of AI and all the technology that we're doing and all the great engineers that we have, I think you can't help but be optimistic. It's funny, I look, sometimes I get into these discussions and people kind of go, our current crop of employees, geez, I'm not sure that they have quite the commitment. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's right. Like, I think we should double down on them, because there's never been a generation that's more like numerate and more socially savvy and more technologically savvy. And yeah, they want balance in their life, and I think kind of have expectations of what their employer should have. But man, are they pretty productive and can do those kinds of things and have seen more of the world than, their parents or grandparents who would have ever seen it. So that's a long-winded way of saying, like, I'm fundamentally pretty optimistic, and I think you've got to take a long-term view. And sure, every now and then, things don't go as well, or we feel we underperform as a country. But I think sometimes we need to get out, look around and go, gosh, it's a pretty amazing place. And if you consider how old it is, it's a really amazing place, right?
I mean, it's an infant in the big picture of the world.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, good.
Look, we're in Calgary, which is about 120 years old, and has 1.5 million people now and growing like crazy. And who would have thought? Like, honestly, right? Which is super sophisticated with people all over the world doing great things.
Yeah. Well, look, I arrived here in Calgary 50 years ago this August.
I told you you're old.
And I'm pretty sure Mom and Dad would choose Canada all over again.
Ditto.
Yeah. Okay, let's wrap up with some fun. I want to ask you some rapid fire questions. So here we go. Tell me one cause that you're passionate about outside of work.
There's actually a couple. One of them is just education generally. I'm the vice chair of Bow Valley College here in town, and I cannot tell you how proud I am of the mission of the college and, how we help people, everything from, advancing their careers in health sciences to giving them, micro-credentialing and helping them with pivot education, and really oriented not so much with kind of theoretical education, but much more practical, in the job, get people working. I think it's unbelievable what happens there. And that's something that it's important to me. The other one is just health generally. My wife has a bit more time than me, and she's on a couple of boards. And the one that I think is most impactful is actually the crisis center here.
The distress center?
Distress center.
I was on that board once
No,
upon
I
a
didn't
time.
know that.
Yeah.
Well,
Many years.
I think Amanda's vice chair. Well, she is vice chair. And her term is coming up, actually.
I chaired it.
And fantastic. And it's an unbelievable
essential
organization.
Service. It's an essential service.
And the amount of work that they do and the amount of people that they touch, as an adjunct to that, kind of the United Way in Calgary, which I think, as you know, is a big organization. And our company is, we've got a giving campaign. Last year was our biggest year ever, just helping the community. We're part of the community, right? So I think if the community in which you live with isn't a healthy one, that's a reflection on, everybody, I think, in the community. So those are the kinds of things.
Great, thank you. Favorite way to relax?
Oh, God, riding motorbikes.
Okay.
For me.
I knew that was going to be the answer, so I have another one coming up later. I know you were very involved in the Calgary Stampede, and then we're talking here in May of 2024. What do you love about the Stampede? It's coming up soon, July.
Yeah, I have a dirty secret to tell about the Stampede.
Oh.
Yeah, so I have a journey with the Stampede. So when I was, I would say, 18, 19, 20, I was not a Stampede guy. I would say, in all honesty, I kind of thought, it doesn't really reflect my, it's sort of foreign to me a little bit. Yeah, it just,
Yahoo.
And it seemed at that time, little did I know the importance of it, almost hokey, I would say, which is kind of a silly way to think of it. Roll forward to today, and I love everything about the Stampede. And, in a world where there's so much convergence, like it's unbelievable when you travel, having something that is unique and actually is, and for me, it was just a lack of understanding and sophistication at the time, that actually celebrates the history of the place, the cultural elements of kind of taking that American sort of cowboy with kind of the British sort of law and order and kind of putting it together and underpinning the city, the notion of community, the notion of helping people in the community, having the Indigenous component, which is so critical to, underpinning where we are today and recognizing that and the influence that it's had on the city today. I think it's a wonderful thing. I mean, the fact that everybody dresses up Western
Yep.
And so it isn't a peripheral thing. It's at the core of who we are. And seeing people
It's a great
from
equalizer.
all walks of
right?
life. Well, no, it is.
I remember it as a great equalizer.
It's
unity,
wonderful.
Unity.
It is unity. And I think it really, I think unity is the best word. It doesn't matter where you came from, what your background is, where you've lived. When you've got a pair of jeans on, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, like you're
belong.
You're
You
part
belong.
of the tribe
Yeah.
here. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Is there a favorite Stampede event that you can't
So
miss?
I'm a rodeo fan. And my wife rolls her eyes at this. She's like, John, really? I love it. A secret pleasure of mine is actually sneaking out during the Stampede and seeing the rodeo in the afternoon. I see what the Cowboys.
At least they now know where you are when they listen to this
They
podcast.
know where I am. Trust me,
I've
they've got
done
my iPhone there. But
done my
but,
service to this organization.
But no, I enjoy it.
You mentioned motorcycles, so let's end on that because I know what a real passion this is of yours.
I do love it.
Your best bike, like your favorite.
Oh
bike.
my God. Probably the bike I learned how to ride on. So I bought a Royal Enfield Bullet, which is...
I'm supposed to be impressed now, right?
No, you're not. But it's a bike that, imagine like a 1950 style old school bike, was a very
Vintage.
famous, very vintage, was a bike that I think it began with the Postal Service in the UK. And it evolved not a lot over the years and became defunct and then was bought by a group in India and are now manufactured in India. So it's the bike that's most pervasive in India, actually, the Royal Enfield. So I bought one as my first bike. It's not very powerful, but it's very raw, if I can put it that way. There's nothing technically advanced about it. It's not...
Sometimes
it's
old is gold.
old is gold. So for me, getting out, and what's great about Calgary is you can actually get out of the city pretty quickly, and then the city does end. So getting out and riding around on a summer day, just hearing the noise from the engine and being alone, I typically ride by myself. It does clear my head.
Is it
And many times
therapeutic?
it is therapeutic. And interestingly, there are many times when I'm grappling with something and a framework or a solution or something, right?
to think.
Subconsciously
Yeah.
pops in.
I'm going to sneak in two quick ones, which is
course.
the best trip that you've ever taken and the one that you most want to take on your bike.
On my bike. Okay, so the best trip I've taken on my bike was, it's funny, I'm going again in a week. I flew down to Las Vegas a few years ago, rented a bike and rode around the Grand Canyon.
Oh, nice.
And stopped in various places.
How long would that take?
It took me 3 days and would stop and do a couple of hikes in the canyon and come out. It was fabulous. And until you physically kind of see it, I rode up through Nevada into Utah and then, through Arizona and then back again. The desert is it's pretty cool, I would say. And the colors are interesting and there's a lot of life there that you wouldn't expect. So it was beautiful.
Nice.
Trip that I'd like to take. So I don't know when I'm going to be able to do this, but I had a buddy and we would always muse about flying to Istanbul, picking up some, ratty old secondhand bikes and riding to Cairo all the way around. And this has been sort of a long-standing dream. And my biggest fear, just given, the turbulence in the region, is that we're never going to get a chance to do it. I'm a bit of a history buff, and that's a part of the world that
it's
has a
special
tremendous
place.
history, right? That would have
Yeah.
been pretty spectacular to
Special
see,
place.
right? Yeah.
Well, look, this company has a great history. You're adding to it with your leadership. Thank you for taking the time for doing this. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you so much.
John Kousinioris is President and CEO of TransAlta. If you would like to hear more of our Speaking of Business conversations with innovators, leaders, and entrepreneurs, why not subscribe to our podcast? Search for Speaking of Business wherever you get your podcasts, or go to our website at thebusinesscouncil.ca. Yes, that's thebusinesscouncil.ca. Until next time, I'm Goldy Hyder. Thanks for joining us.